It was a warm June afternoon in Indianapolis, Indiana, 2018. Inside a rented wedding hall, guests were settling into their seats. Soft music played through the speakers as friends and relatives turned toward the aisle, ready to watch 29-year-old Pastor Reggie Baxter Jr. marry his fiancée, Danielle Ford. The chairs were lined in white, the aisle runners sprinkled with rose petals, and the groom stood at the altar in a fitted navy suit. The moment was quiet, expectant, until a single gunshot cut through the music. It was loud, sharp, and unmistakable. Gasps turned into screams. Some guests instinctively crouched or moved toward the walls. Others rushed toward the front, unsure of what had just happened. Within seconds, multiple witnesses realized the groom had been shot. At the front left row, a woman remained seated in a wheelchair, a black semi-automatic pistol still in her hands. Guests recognized her instantly. This was Lorraine Baxter, the groom's mother. The first 911 call came in less than 30 seconds after the shot. A woman's voice, high and trembling, told the dispatcher, "The groom's been shot. It's his mom, she's in a wheelchair." Danielle Ford moved quickly toward Lorraine. She grabbed the weapon from her hands, passing it to a man nearby who stepped back toward the wall and held it until officers arrived. Danielle then dropped to her knees beside her fiancé. Two men helped ease him onto the aisle runner, one applying direct pressure to his chest, the other holding his head still. Blood had already begun to soak through the front of his shirt. Across the aisle, Reggie's father, Reginald Baxter Sr., stood frozen several rows back. He kept his eyes fixed on his son but did not move forward. Witnesses would later confirm that he remained in place until police entered the room. Reggie Baxter Jr. was lifted onto a gurney and taken toward the waiting ambulance. Lorraine Baxter was escorted out separately, her wheelchair rolling over the same aisle runner her son had walked just minutes earlier. Outside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles reflected off the glass doors as she was loaded into a patrol van. For those in attendance, the entire sequence had unfolded in under 10 minutes. One moment it was a wedding. The next, it was a crime scene. The shooter was not a stranger, not an intruder, but the groom's own mother, a woman already known in her community for her battle with multiple sclerosis and for the years she had devoted to raising the son she had just shot. In the hours that followed, police began piecing together how this day had turned from a celebration into a tragedy, and why a mother had brought a loaded gun to her son's wedding. The answers would not be found in that hall, but in years of family conflict, broken trust, and decisions that had been building toward this moment long before the first guest took their seat. Years before the wedding day, the Baxter household appeared to be intact. Reginald Baxter Sr. and Lorraine Baxter were still married, raising their teenage son, Reggie Jr., in a modest home on the east side of Indianapolis. Reginald worked full-time, while Lorraine stayed home, managing the household as she had for years at his insistence. The first crack appeared over something seemingly small, a name in Lorraine's phone. Reginald had been scrolling through her contacts when he noticed an entry saved as mine. The actual name, he discovered, was Benjamin Cole, a man who worked with Lorraine part-time when she briefly assisted with a community outreach project. To Lorraine, mine was nothing more than a friendly nickname between coworkers. To Reginald, it was evidence of something inappropriate. The discovery sparked repeated arguments. Reginald began checking Lorraine's phone without her knowledge, reading messages and scanning call logs. Though there was no evidence of a romantic relationship, his suspicion didn't fade. He began telling mutual friends that his wife was seeing someone else, and the rumor spread quietly among acquaintances. Within months, Reginald escalated his accusations into public posts. On his personal Facebook account, he uploaded 2 photographs taken with his phone, images of Lorraine and Benjamin seated at a small cafe table, coffee cups between them. They appeared to be mid-conversation, unaware of the camera. Reginald captioned the photos with pointed remarks about loyalty and knowing your worth, prompting comments from people who recognized Lorraine. Family members who saw the posts described them as humiliating. Lorraine confronted Reginald about the public accusations, but he refused to remove the photos. He insisted that people deserved to know what she was doing, even though no physical evidence supported his claims. The tension at home grew worse. Reginald became distant, often leaving the house for hours without explanation. He would return late, speaking little to Lorraine or Reggie Jr. The once civil family dinners turned into quiet meals punctuated by short exchanges or arguments about where Lorraine had been and who she had spoken to that day. By this point, the atmosphere inside the Baxter home had shifted entirely. Friends who visited noticed the lack of warmth between the couple. Reggie Jr., still in high school, often retreated to his room to avoid the confrontations. The incident with Benjamin Cole remained a constant source of friction. Though Benjamin himself maintained that his relationship with Lorraine was purely platonic, the narrative Reginald believed, and publicly repeated, had already taken hold. In his mind, the marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a contest for control, one that would soon spill into decisions affecting the entire family. The turning point came late one evening when Lorraine returned home earlier than expected. Reginald's car was already in the driveway, but the living room lights were dim. As she stepped inside, she found him seated on the couch with another woman. They weren't talking. The scene, as Lorraine would later describe to friends, left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The woman gathered her things and left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Reginald offered no explanation. Within weeks, Lorraine filed for divorce. In court filings, she cited irreconcilable differences and presented the incident as part of a broader pattern of infidelity. Reginald did not dispute the separation. Instead, he focused on ensuring that Reggie Jr., still a teenager, would not live with him. According to custody records, he declined both primary and shared custody, stating he had no intention of hosting his son and preferred that all parental responsibilities remain with Lorraine. The decision effectively severed the father-son relationship. Reggie's legal residence was with his mother, and all visitation was left to Reginald's discretion, visitation he never pursued. From that point forward, their contact was minimal, limited to occasional chance encounters in public spaces. For Lorraine, the divorce marked the start of a difficult new chapter. She had spent years as a full-time homemaker, relying entirely on Reginald's income. Without savings of her own, she faced the challenge of supporting herself and her son on limited resources. For Reggie Jr., the split seemed to solidify his path. In conversations with classmates and members of his church youth group, he began speaking openly about his plans to enter ministry. Becoming a pastor, he said, was not just a career choice but a calling. Those close to him at the time recall how he threw himself into church activities, volunteering for services, and seeking mentorship from older ministers. Reginald Sr., meanwhile, moved on quickly. Neighbors and acquaintances would later tell investigators they rarely heard him mention his former wife or son. His life after the divorce appeared to exclude them entirely, both socially and financially. The Baxter family was now divided into two separate worlds, one centered on a mother and son navigating life after abandonment, and the other on a father determined to distance himself from both. It was a split that would never fully heal, and one that laid the groundwork for the choices and alliances that followed. Her first months on her own were spent searching for any employment she could find. She started with part-time work at a local grocery store, stocking shelves during the early morning hours. In the afternoons, she cleaned offices for a small janitorial service. On weekends, she took shifts at a diner, bussing tables and occasionally covering the register. The hours were long, the pay low, but it was enough to keep her and Reggie in a modest rental home. At the same time, Reggie Jr. was entering theology school. Tuition and related expenses were more than Lorraine could comfortably afford, but she made it a priority. Every extra hour she worked, every weekend she gave up, was in service of keeping him in school. Friends recalled seeing her at community events still in her work uniform, quietly mentioning she had to leave early to get to her next shift. The physical strain began to show. Years of sedentary living as a homemaker had not prepared her for the demands of multiple labor-intensive jobs. But she pressed on, telling those close to her that she wouldn't let her son's education suffer because of the divorce. About 2 years after the split, Lorraine remarried. Her new husband, Howard Gibbs, was older and financially stable, at least on paper. Initially, the marriage offered relief from some of the constant pressure. Lorraine reduced her workload slightly, expecting to settle into a more balanced life. That balance didn't last. From the start, Howard and Reggie had a strained relationship. Howard saw Reggie as a distraction and resented the financial and emotional support Lorraine continued to give him. Arguments began almost immediately about money, about Reggie's frequent visits, about Lorraine's refusal to cut the cord with her son. The tension escalated over the following months. Friends recalled overhearing Howard make blunt, dismissive remarks about Reggie during gatherings. Lorraine, unwilling to subject her son to hostility in his own mother's home, began spending more time away when Reggie visited. After just 1 year, Lorraine ended the marriage. The decision left her once again on her own, returning to the same patchwork of jobs she had relied on before. The brief reprieve she'd found was gone, replaced by the same grind of early mornings, late nights, and constant financial calculation. Through it all, she remained committed to supporting Reggie's path into ministry. She paid his rent when he needed it, covered unexpected expenses, and made sure he had the means to focus on his studies and early work in the church. Her sacrifices during this period would form a cornerstone of the bond she believed they shared, a bond that, in the years to come, would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. When Reggie Baxter Jr. completed his theology training, he was eager to move from student to leader. He had no permanent church home and no formal backing from a larger denomination. Starting a ministry from the ground up would require money, space, and equipment, resources he didn't have. Lorraine Baxter stepped in without hesitation. Using savings she had scraped together over the years, she covered the deposit and first few months' rent on a small storefront in Indianapolis. The space had once been a laundromat. Its bare walls and linoleum floors offered nothing in the way of atmosphere, but Lorraine saw potential. She also paid for a modest sound system, folding chairs, and second-hand podium, sourcing most of the items from local classifieds and church supply resellers. In the beginning, the services drew only a handful of attendees, mostly family friends, neighbors, and a few curious locals who noticed the new signage. Lorraine handled the administrative tasks, managing small donations, keeping track of rent due dates, and ordering printed flyers for outreach. She often stayed after services to sweep the floors and wipe down chairs, leaving long after Reggie had gone home. The early months were difficult. Offerings were minimal, and there were weeks when Lorraine quietly added her own cash to the collection plate to make it appear fuller. She viewed it as an investment in her son's vision, not a loss. Gradually, attendance began to climb. Reggie organized food drives, small concerts, and holiday events to bring people into the space. Lorraine funded much of it, paying for refreshments, decorations, and even gas cards for volunteers who transported donated goods. She rarely took credit, preferring to stand to the side and watch as her son led from the front. By the second year, the congregation had grown to several dozen regular attendees. Families began joining, children's activities were added, and midweek Bible studies brought in more faces. Lorraine continued to serve in the background, arriving early to unlock the doors and staying late to clean. Within a few years, Sunday attendance surpassed 100. The once empty storefront now buzzed with life. Lorraine's fingerprints were on nearly every aspect of it. Though most in the congregation knew her simply as the pastor's mother, they were unaware of the financial and physical commitment she had made to keep the ministry afloat in its earliest days. For Lorraine, these efforts were more than acts of support. They were the continuation of years spent ensuring her son's opportunities, from his schooling to his first pulpit. She believed in his calling and in the church they had built together. That belief, and the sacrifices behind it, formed the foundation of what she thought was an unshakable bond between them. Several years into the growth of Reggie Baxter Jr.'s ministry, another shift began, one that Lorraine Baxter didn't see coming. Reginald Baxter Sr., now living alone, had fallen on difficult times. His once steady income was gone, and his health had begun to decline. Friends later described him as thinner, slower in movement, and increasingly reliant on others for transportation to appointments. It was during this period that Reginald reached out to his son. The contact was private. No one in the congregation, and certainly not Lorraine, knew at first. According to records uncovered later, the first meeting was arranged over a short series of text messages. Within weeks, Reggie was visiting his father regularly, sometimes taking him to medical checkups, sometimes just meeting for meals. The relationship that had been severed during Reggie's teenage years began to reform. But it wasn't just time and attention Reggie was giving. Bank statements would later show recurring transfers from Reggie's account to his father's, amounts varying from small sums for groceries to larger payments that covered medical expenses. On at least 2 occasions, bills from a local clinic were paid directly from Reggie's personal debit card. The support extended beyond cash. Reginald Sr. received help with transportation, prescriptions, and household necessities. For a man who had once refused custody and cut off contact, it was a significant change. For Lorraine, the shift was less visible but no less real. She noticed her son's visits to her becoming less frequent. Weeks passed without him stopping by. Calls that had once been returned quickly began stretching into days. When they did speak, his updates on church matters became shorter, and questions about his personal life were brushed aside. She did not know he was spending increasing amounts of time with the man who had left them behind years earlier. She only knew that the attention and presence she had counted on were quietly slipping away. The support she had given to build his ministry, and the personal sacrifices behind it, no longer seemed to keep him close. For Reggie, this new connection with his father was becoming a regular part of his life. For Lorraine, the change was a gradual but noticeable absence, one she could not yet explain, but which marked the beginning of a deeper divide. The confirmation of what Lorraine Baxter had been sensing came from someone outside the family. It was a Sunday afternoon, a few hours after the church service had ended, when longtime congregant Patrice Henson stopped by Lorraine's home. Patrice, who had known Lorraine since the church's early days, carried her phone in her hand. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. She told Lorraine she had seen something online that she thought she should know about. Opening her Facebook app, Patrice pulled up a post from the day before. There, in the center of the screen, was a photograph of Pastor Reggie Baxter Jr. seated at an outdoor cafe table. Across from him, smiling into the camera, was his father, Reginald Baxter Sr. The caption read simply, "Good to be out with my son." The image was recent, uploaded less than 24 hours earlier. The cafe's recognizable signage in the background confirmed it had been taken in Indianapolis. Lorraine's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. It had been 3 months since Reggie last visited her. Calls between them had become infrequent. Now, the explanation for his absence was in front of her. Patrice didn't offer an opinion. She simply scrolled down to show that the post had several comments from people in Reginald Sr.'s circle, all expressing happiness that father and son were spending time together again. None of the names were familiar to Lorraine. She handed the phone back without a word. There was no outburst, no confrontation that day. Instead, the moment passed quietly, but the silence carried weight. Lorraine now knew her son had been seeing the man who had abandoned them, something he had never mentioned. From that day forward, the conversations between mother and son grew even shorter. Invitations to visit her went unanswered for longer periods. When they did speak, their exchanges were polite but distant. The photo Patrice had shown her marked a point of no return in the closeness they once shared. Lorraine didn't bring up the Facebook post to Reggie. She kept what she'd learned to herself, but the gap between them, already forming, widened into something deeper and harder to repair. The next shift in the Baxter family dynamic came quietly, without any announcement to Lorraine Baxter. At some point in late 2017, Pastor Reggie Baxter Jr. proposed to his girlfriend, Danielle Ford. Friends from within the church would later recall that the news spread quickly among certain circles, but it never reached Lorraine directly from her son. One of the first people Reggie told was his father. Reginald Baxter Sr. Records later obtained from the wedding venue confirmed that Reginald Sr. was among the earliest names placed on the guest list. Seating charts showed him positioned prominently on the groom's side, near the front, in full view of the ceremony. For Lorraine, the information came much later. She didn't learn of the engagement through a conversation or even an official announcement. By the time she received her invitation, the date and location had already been set, deposits paid, and most of the seating arranged. Venue correspondence revealed that her name was added to the final list after initial invitations had already been sent. The timing was unmistakable. The man who had abandoned the family decades earlier had been told and included early. The mother who had supported her son's life and ministry from the ground up was informed last. The arrangement of the seating chart added another layer. Lorraine was placed on the bride's side, front left row, a position that kept her in full view of the altar but separate from most of Reggie's immediate supporters. Meanwhile, Reginald Sr.'s seat, on the opposite side, had been confirmed weeks in advance. Those decisions, though not discussed openly between mother and son, underscored a change Lorraine had already felt. Her role in Reggie's life was no longer central. For a woman who had given everything to ensure his success, the order in which she learned of his engagement, and the way she was positioned at his wedding, sent a message she could not ignore. The most damaging revelations in the investigation would not emerge until after the wedding day shooting, when detectives began examining Reggie Baxter Jr.'s digital history and financial activities. Among the findings was a disturbing pattern, evidence that Reggie had been exploring ways to profit from his mother's death. Search records pulled from his personal laptop and phone showed multiple queries related to life insurance. These included contestability period after policy change, accidental death insurance payout, and how long before beneficiary can collect. The searches were spread over several weeks in early 2018, well after his engagement to Danielle Ford but before the wedding invitations had gone out. Investigators also obtained call logs from Lorraine Baxter's insurance provider. Representatives confirmed that Reggie had phoned on more than one occasion, inquiring about the specifics of her policy. He had asked detailed questions about beneficiary designations and the conditions under which a claim could be denied. The calls stopped short of requesting changes, but they were notable enough for the insurer's internal notes to flag them. In addition to the calls, a draft document granting Reggie power of attorney over Lorraine's affairs was found in his email. The file was never signed, but its existence suggested preparation for greater control over her financial matters. The metadata on the document showed it had been created just a month before the wedding date was set. The most personal confirmation of his intent came from Danielle Ford. In her interview with detectives, She recalled a late-night conversation in which Reggie made a comment about how things would be easier if his mother were no longer alive. According to Danielle, he referred specifically to her insurance policy as the last thing she had of real value. She told investigators she initially brushed it off as a frustrated remark, but later began to believe he was serious. By the time these findings were compiled, investigators were no longer viewing the wedding shooting as an act born from a sudden argument. To them, it was the endpoint of a sequence that began with deliberate planning by Reggie, planning that his mother may have only learned about in the final days before the ceremony. Danielle Ford's account of the days leading up to the wedding added a critical link in the chain of events. After hearing Reggie Baxter Jr. speak about his mother's life insurance as the last thing she had of real value, she could not shake the thought that he might be serious. His earlier questions to the insurer and the unsigned power of attorney document were not things she had known about in detail, but his casual tone and choice of words stayed with her. Rather than confront him directly, Danielle decided to find a way to alert Lorraine Baxter without making herself a visible part of the conflict. She reached out to someone she believed could act as a discreet intermediary, longtime church member Patrice Henson. Patrice had known Lorraine for years, was trusted, and often visited her outside of church functions. Danielle met with Patrice in a public cafe, speaking quietly and avoiding specifics about how she had learned the information. She told Patrice that Reggie had been talking about his mother's death in connection to her insurance and that she believed it was not just idle talk. She asked Patrice to ensure Lorraine knew, and then left it in her hands. Later that same day, Patrice placed a call to Lorraine. When it went unanswered, she left a brief voicemail, saying there was something important to discuss and that it concerned her safety. Patrice added that someone close to her had heard talk of a plan involving her life insurance. She did not mention Danielle by name in the message. Phone records later confirmed that Lorraine listened to the voicemail that evening. There is no indication she attempted to call Patrice back immediately, and no evidence of her reaching out to Reggie about the warning. Those close to her would later say she became quieter in the days that followed, but no one saw or heard her initiate any confrontation. Whatever Lorraine decided in that moment, she kept it to herself. The warning had been given. The response, if there was one, remained unspoken. In the week leading up to the wedding, Lorraine Baxter made quiet preparations of her own. At her home, she retrieved a firearm she had legally owned for years. Purchased back when she was still able to walk without assistance, it had been stored in a locked cabinet in her bedroom. Friends would later say she had never spoken about selling it or getting rid of it, even after her multiple sclerosis progressed to the point where she required a wheelchair. The handgun was a compact semi-automatic, small enough to fit inside the zippered compartment of a bag that attached to her chair. There is no evidence she told anyone she was bringing it to the ceremony, and no indication that anyone helped her transport it. Venue staff later recalled seeing Lorraine arrive early on the wedding day, assisted by a relative of one of the bride's attendants. She was settled into her seat before most guests entered, her wheelchair angled slightly toward the aisle. She kept her bag close, resting it against her lap. The guest list had been finalized with over 100 attendees. Among them were church members, family friends, and a mix of relatives from both sides. But for Lorraine, the most notable names on the list were the man who had abandoned her and the son she had raised alone, now about to marry, and whom she believed had been plotting against her. The stage for the ceremony was set. Every detail was in place. The people who mattered most in this long and complicated story would soon be in the same room for the first time in years. The wedding began without incident. Guests took their seats, music filled the hall, and the bridal party prepared for the processional. From multiple recordings later reviewed by investigators, the sequence was clear. As the first notes of the aisle music played, Reggie Baxter Jr. stood at the altar, glancing toward the entrance where Danielle Ford would appear. Across the aisle, his father sat on the groom's side, and directly opposite him, Lorraine Baxter waited in her wheelchair, her bag positioned on her lap. Seconds later, a single gunshot cut through the music. Reggie collapsed forward. Guests froze, then screamed. Danielle moved quickly, grabbing the weapon from Lorraine's hands and passing it to another guest. Several people rushed to Reggie, pressing cloth against his chest. A 911 call was made within moments, reporting that the shooter was the groom's mother and that the gun had been secured. Police arrived in minutes, taking possession of the weapon and positioning an officer beside Lorraine. Paramedics treated Reggie where he fell before moving him to a gurney and toward the waiting ambulance. The entire incident, from the first notes of the processional to police securing the scene, lasted less than 10 minutes. For those who had come expecting to witness a wedding, it had become something else entirely. In the hours after the shooting, investigators began the process of collecting statements and evidence. Danielle Ford was interviewed first. She described the moment of the shooting, her decision to take the gun from Lorraine Baxter, and her prior concerns about Reggie's comments regarding his mother's life insurance. She confirmed she had warned Lorraine indirectly, using Patrice Henson as a go-between. Reginald Baxter Sr. was questioned next. He acknowledged meeting regularly with his son in the months leading up to the wedding but denied any knowledge of a plan to harm Lorraine. When asked about the financial assistance he received, he admitted Reggie had been helping with bills and medical costs, though he framed it as voluntary support from his son to his father. Patrice Henson confirmed Danielle had approached her with concerns before the wedding and that she had left a voicemail for Lorraine warning her. She also stated that Lorraine never mentioned the message again, and Patrice had no way of knowing whether it had influenced her actions. Benjamin Cole was interviewed to address the earlier rumors that had once fueled the family rift. He maintained that his relationship with Lorraine had been purely professional and platonic, tied to the community outreach work they had done together. He also confirmed that Reginald Sr. had taken the coffee photographs without their knowledge and had publicly implied an affair. Alongside these interviews, detectives reviewed Reggie's financial records. Bank statements showed a clear pattern of payments to his father over several months, amounts that aligned with dates of documented medical visits and household expenses. Digital forensics on Reggie's laptop and phone uncovered call logs to Lorraine's life insurance provider, notes from those calls, and the saved draft of a power of attorney document naming him as the primary decision-maker over her affairs. While the document had never been executed, its presence, combined with the insurance inquiries, was flagged as significant. By the end of the first week, investigators had a timeline, a rekindled relationship between father and son, financial ties between them, documented interest in Lorraine's life insurance policy, and a warning from Danielle that never resulted in a direct confrontation. The shooting itself was no longer viewed in isolation. It was the culmination of a series of actions and decisions that had begun months, if not years, earlier. Lorraine Baxter was formally charged with murder. The indictment came less than 2 weeks after the wedding, and from the outset, both sides prepared for a case that would hinge not only on the facts of the shooting but on her state of mind when she pulled the trigger. The defense framed the case around extreme emotional disturbance. They argued that Lorraine had been living with the knowledge, passed to her through Danielle Ford and Patrice Henson, that her own son was plotting to take her life for insurance money. Combined with her declining health from multiple sclerosis, the defense claimed she perceived an imminent threat that the justice system could not address in time. They described her actions as the desperate response of a mother who believed she had no other way to protect herself. The prosecution took the opposite view. They focused on premeditation, pointing to the fact that Lorraine brought a loaded firearm to a wedding ceremony. They presented the seating chart, showing she had a clear, direct line to the aisle, and highlighted the absence of any immediate confrontation or attempt to leave before the processional began. To them, her decision to fire was not a split-second reaction but a planned act carried out in public. Expert testimony was called on both sides. A neurologist for the defense explained how multiple sclerosis can affect mental processing, decision-making under stress, and overall resilience in the face of perceived danger. The prosecution's expert countered that while the disease impacts physical mobility, it does not inherently impair judgment to the degree suggested, and nothing in her medical records indicated cognitive decline severe enough to explain the shooting. Witnesses from the investigation, including Danielle, Patrice, and Reginald Sr., took the stand. Danielle repeated her account of the warning she tried to give. Patrice confirmed she delivered it. Reginald Sr. denied any knowledge of a plot, but under questioning, admitted the financial support he received from Reggie. Throughout the trial, Lorraine remained seated in her wheelchair, listening without visible reaction. Her legal team maintained that the case was not about denying she fired the gun, it was about why. The prosecution closed by reminding the jury that bringing a firearm to a wedding was not the act of someone who had no intention of using it. The decision would now rest with the jury, tasked with determining whether Lorraine Baxter's actions were born from a moment of overwhelming fear or from deliberate intent. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Lorraine Baxter was found guilty of a lesser charge, voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The decision reflected the jury's acknowledgement of the warning she had received and her belief, however misguided, that her life was in danger. At sentencing, the judge weighed those factors against the reality that she had brought a loaded firearm to her son's wedding and used it in front of more than 100 witnesses. Lorraine was given a prison term significantly shorter than the maximum, with the possibility of parole after serving a portion of her sentence. Danielle Ford, whose warning had indirectly set events in motion, was never charged. Prosecutors determined she had no legal obligation to inform police and that her attempt to alert Lorraine, though ineffective, had been genuine. Reginald Baxter Sr. faced his own reckoning. In the months after the trial, civil scrutiny turned toward his financial ties to the church. Questions arose about the funds Reggie had used to support him, particularly whether any of that money had come directly from church accounts. While no criminal charges were filed, the attention damaged his reputation and severed his remaining connections to the congregation. With its pastor gone and its future uncertain, the church's board appointed an interim leader to stabilize operations. Attendance declined in the months that followed, and some members quietly left for other congregations. Those who remained tried to preserve what was left of the ministry Lorraine had helped start years earlier. Lorraine's case closed as one more example of how a family rift, left unresolved, can grow into something irreversible. What began with suspicion over a phone contact name and years of silence and distance ended with a fatal act on a day meant for celebration. In the end, it left us with only a fractured family, a lost life, and a community left to reconcile the difference between the pastor they once knew and the tragedy that defined his final day.